You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and welcome back to NCR 507, which is our course on research design and interpretation. Now, today we're going to start a brand new class, and this class is basically in two main areas. One is quantitative analysis, and the other is in program evaluation. Now, you may be wondering why the focus on quantitative analysis. Well, our task is to become proficient actually in quantitative analysis so that you and I can make better choices for the organizations we serve and the people that we help. Now, one of the things you're noticing is that you are involved in an online format. And as you're involved in this online format, be aware that it's important for you to read all of the announcements, all of the reading, and anything associated with the course to make sure that you're on track for understanding what we're learning. Now, one of the things to know about quantitative methods is that sometimes it can become very complicated. So when we think about complicated analysis, my comment would be that it's very important for you to understand that my role is to simplify it. There are a lot of people in our world who make numbers way too hard. And I think that it is very important for us to simplify and get some basic competencies around this idea of quantitative methods. So today we're going to focus on a number of different topics, really three main areas. We're going to talk about the basics of measurement, we're going to talk about why we do measure things, and then what we do with the results. And as we think about those main ideas, we can lay the foundation for our course as we begin it. So the first thing we want to distinguish is the notion of quantitative and qualitative. And some people use these terms interchangeably. They actually represent a very different point of view. And so I want to clarify these terms for you. The first term is quantitative. And when we talk about quantitative, we want to talk about the idea that when I do research, I capture the answer, whatever I'm researching, in numbers. And so that means that when I get a return on whatever I'm researching, I capture numbers. When we talk about qualitative, we're talking about capturing qualities of something. So when we think about doing qualitative data analysis, we're actually capturing sometimes categories or words. We're capturing things that aren't numbers in order to find out answers to our inquiry or our research. So when we think about quantitative, we think we're capturing numbers, and qualitative, we're capturing qualities. And that's the main distinction. So as we make choices about the things that we're researching, it's very imperative for us to understand what it is we know and then make very intelligent design strategies in order to accomplish the research that we want to do. The next clip that we're going to see kind of goes through the basics of decision making and research design. When you decide you want to examine a certain variable, the decision about what methodological approach to use is best informed from a theoretical framework. In other words, your decision about how to collect data should originate with what you believe that you want to know or investigate in theory. In all research projects, you will be faced with the question about what you actually want to know, and it is important to create an actual plan. We start first with our research question or hypothesis. Next, decide your method. Do you want qualitative answers or do you want quantitative answers? Finally, decide what type of data output you wish to capture. Is it values, categories, and/or attributes? Let's go through each of these parts in more detail. Step one is to identify your research question or hypothesis. Are you asking a question about a variable, or are you making a prediction? This decision will depend on what you already know. Step two is to determine your method. It is important to make the distinction between qualitative and quantitative data. Do you want to capture the data in words? That's qualitative data, and these are known as categories or attributes. Or do you want to capture numbers? This is called quantitative data, and these are known as values, or you may think of them as numbers. Step three, collect your data. You may collect values, categories, or attributes, or you may use a combination of any of these. In review, we can see the importance of each step of the research process, where we make decisions about inquiry, method, and data. Now let's look at an applied example of conducting research. Suppose you are interested in conducting a study about conflicts in the workplace, As a researcher, you would have several key decisions to make. Let's look at an example of a qualitative study. You might select a research question such as, in the workplace, what are the categories of conflicts that individuals engage in? Next, you will decide your method. If you elect to use qualitative data collection method, then you'll have data that is comprised of words, such as named conflict topics. This is suitable given the research question that you started with. Finally, this qualitative method would result in named categories of conflict. Overall, you can see how a researcher's decisions shape the outcome of the data. Now, depending on your research interest, you may elect to do a quantitative method. You might decide to make a prediction and therefore select a hypothesis. Here's an example. In the workplace, men will engage in more conflicts significantly more frequently than women. Next, you will need to decide your method. If you elect to use a quantitative data collection method, then you will have data that is comprised of numbers or values. This is suitable given the hypothesis that you originally stated. Finally, this quantitative method would result in data that is comprised of numbers, such as the number of times conflicts occur in a given week. As you can see, the researcher's decisions shape the outcomes of the data. Remember that your decision about the method of data collection depends on what you actually want to know as a researcher. Ultimately, you will need to decide if you are seeking answers about qualities or you are seeking answers about quantities. In some cases, you might decide that you wish to explore both aspects of a certain variable, and that is what is called using mixed methods, or the use of multiple methods of data collection in one study. But regardless of your decision, you now know the entire process of decision-making planning involved in research design. So we can see that the process is a step-by-step strategy that will execute on our research endeavor. And so when you think about it, we start with what we know, we use a method for what we're trying to discover, we capture those results, and each choice that we make in that process affects the outcome. Now, of course, we would want to make a distinction right here between the hard sciences and social science. We can't go on too much longer without talking about the presence of humans. But let's start with the hard sciences. When I say the word science to you, what do you think about? You think about physics. You think about chemistry. You think about astronomy. We think about sciences in a very easy reference where we identify them very quickly. And when you think about social science, we think about those social sciences that involve the presence of humans. So we think about communication studies, anthropology, we might think about psychology, sociology. All of these areas would be areas to study that have the presence of humans in terms of the area of inquiry. Now, when we think about the difference between hard science and social science, I like to use the example of boiling water. And when I think about this example, I think it helps us understand the issues of replication and control. So let's think about the hard science part of this notion. Let's say I want to do a study in my laboratory. So you and I go down campus and we decide we're going to go into my laboratory, and I see a Bunsen burner and I see a pan, and so I fill the pan with water, I put it on the Bunsen burner. What happens? Well, it boils. And that's easy, right? We expected it to boil. So then I decide the next day I'm going to do the same experiment. So the next day I go down to my laboratory. You come with me. We go down to the laboratory, we take the water, we put the same amount of water in that pan, we put it on the Bunsen burner at the same temperature. What happens? It boils. And what we're seeing in that situation is we're seeing the ability for the hard sciences to have the controls and also to be replicated, meaning that the experiment can be repeated. Now let's think about running an experiment involving humans, right? That first example was really about hard science. When we put humans into the mix, all of a sudden we introduce a bunch of complication into our study. And of course, that doesn't surprise any of us. So let's think about going down to the laboratory. I take a few humans down to the laboratory with me, and I'm trying to figure out, what is a person's boiling point? A different enterprise for sure. So let's think about measuring a person's boiling point. I might bring that person or couple into the laboratory, and I might say things to that person or ask questions and see if I can possibly incite that boiling point response. But here's the reality. What is a boiling point for one person on one day won't be the same boiling point for that person on the next day. And that introduces problems of replication and of controlling, right? We can't take this experiment and expect the same results. So one of the things that we would observe between hard and social science is the presence of humans makes the experiment more complicated and introduces error and also some variables that are not even controllable. So as we're thinking about it, one of the ideas is to accept the complexities of humans in the experiment and understand that we follow sets of rules in quantitative analysis to try to control for as much as we can given the complexity of a human. Well, when we think about all of these ideas and we understand the complexities, it makes a lot of sense for us to talk about how those show up in real life. And so the next clip that I want you to see is an interview that I did last year with Wesley Acker, and it talks about measurement in context, some different environments where he's worked that are related to our program. Let's take a look. Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Wesley Acker. He's from Orange County Human Relations, and he does restorative practices as a specialist. And so welcome to the show, Wesley.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Glad to have you here. What we wanted to talk about today were two kind of areas where I know you work, and that is in restorative practices or justice, and then also in court. And so thought we would start maybe our conversation really revolving around this concept of measurement. So the idea is when we're trying to measure something, how do we do it in those two contexts?
Yeah, it can be challenging.
Right.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the hard statistics that we can gather, those are always going to be easy. And like when we're at court, there's certain ways we measure it very clearly. When we're talking about what we do with restorative practice and restorative justice, it's really about what happens with those cases and what we can track afterwards.
Okay, so let's back up and let's talk about, I know we have this thing we call restorative justice, and then we also have restorative practices. So could you help us understand like what is the difference or similarity between those two things?
Sure. If you were talking about restorative justice, this is actually part of a justice system that allows kind of a rehabilitation of offender back into the community that they came from. It also offers a chance for potential ways to let the victim have an interaction that is potentially healing or engaging to make the situation more like it was. That's why they call it restorative justice.
Okay.
Whereas in the punitive system, they're going to be sent away for a long time, and jail time is typically what we would see.
Right.
And that means they're isolated from their community. Okay. And it's going to be difficult to reintegrate them. And it really doesn't necessarily address the needs that got them there.
Okay, so what would be a typical case like that you might see in restorative justice?
In restorative justice, you can start all the way with capital offense.
Okay.
There's ways that they can use the process to be helpful in making things move forward for all parties.
Okay.
Victim, offender, everyone. But it comes all the way down to the type of things we're doing in schools. Okay. And that means there's misbehavior, there's fights, there's reasons for detention, suspension, so forth. And what we're trying to offer are ways that we learn a little more about their situation and hopefully can create a little better outcome.
Okay, so you work specifically in the schools, is my understanding.
Right.
Okay, so tell us about your role and what you're doing now in that program.
So with the restorative practice side, what we are attempting to do is we're embedding specialists within the school system, specific to a school. We get to know the community. Okay. We give trainings for the teachers that let them start using the practice, which is certain activities that help create a community, okay. A culture where the parties, meaning the students in this case, have a chance to be heard. Their voice is heard. If there is misbehavior, we take time to learn about what caused their choices. We find out what happened to the victims. We get to hear how it's affected others. And then we're usually able to bring them together and have a dialogue that they can make things right.
Okay, so that seems like we're addressing causes, not just effects then. is what I hear ideally.
It's a process.
Okay.
There's a lot involved. It's very complex.
Okay, well, I certainly hear that.
Yeah.
A question that I have, of course, that's tied to measurement is, I guess someone funds this? Is this a government-funded program? Who funds like the type of work that you do?
Specifically with the restorative practice that we're using for schools. Currently, let's say the program we're working with has 3 full-time people embedded with Anaheim School District. So they're with 3 specific schools. I happen to be with Tustin Unified. So what we're doing there is we're spending time to actually get to know the community and provide the trainings that make the cultural change.
Okay, so
So the funding,
yeah.
to answer your question, the funding is coming 50% from the school districts,
oh, okay.
and then 50% coming from funding we are able to find through the agency.
Oh, okay. And so then I imagine you have to report back to them on what you did with that money. I guess the other way of asking that question is, how do you prove it's working?
Absolutely. And that's always going to be the challenge in something like this. They're going to have hard numbers, specifically the number of suspensions, detentions, the time that they have to send a student to the vice principal for some kind of disciplinary action. More importantly, we know they have those numbers, but they want to know what we are specifically doing. How many times we've made presentations to parent-teacher organizations, to staff, and how many times we may have interacted with the students directly in what we call a conference. And it means where we bring everybody together to address the harm that's done.
Okay. So you can measure, or what I heard you saying is that you measure elements of the productivity side, meaning that you do trainings, you have meetings, you have some time saved on the part of administration. You talked about that. Is that hard to measure? I mean, I kind of think, how do you know if something this deeply rooted, like embedded in changing sort of a culture, like how do you get a measurement out of that?
Right.
Like of effectiveness, you know, how do we at the end of the day say, hey, we did something here, like this is worthy of more funding?
And that is the larger question. So we're going to give those hard numbers of events, incidents, so forth. Then we have to go using some qualitative method to explore what is the experience for the parties, for the teachers.
Okay.
Do they feel like the environment is changing? Are they having to ask for quiet more often? We're giving them new ways to communicate with the students. We're going to ask them, do they feel like those new methods are bringing better results? Because that's happening live time right there. So it's very difficult to measure at this point.
Yeah. So is a fair measurement like how satisfied someone is with the culture?
It has to start there.
Okay.
We'll have to have what we call buy-in, and that means teachers, administrators, and the parents that are going to be involved in our trainings. If they feel like it matters, it's making a difference. But the things that'll never be able to be measured are whether the student has a new way to address conflict in their life. We can't measure that for the rest of their lives, as much as we would like to. We hope that since we're working with middle schools, we hope when they get to high school, there's going to be an ongoing effect that we'll see the numbers come down in suspension, detention.
So we have the hard measurement like suspension, right, detention, these different things. Would it be a fair measurement to say they stay out of prison? Would it be a fair measurement to say they have not been convicted of a crime? Like, is that?
It's a fair measurement.
Okay.
It may not, because of the complexity, it may not indicate that we were a certain level of effectiveness when we applied the principles, the trainings, the activities.
Because time happens in that whole
And
sequence.
there's all these other influences that may come into their lives.
Right.
So there was one case where a young lady went through 5 conferences. She had to go through these whole processes, right? And it wasn't until the 5th time that she decided, man, I'm doing this to myself. So if you had measured us in 1, 2, 3, 4 times, you would say this is useless. So the buy-in is that we believe we're helping to create a healthy environment. learning, and so, yeah.
Yeah, so humans who don't want to learn the lessons easily and learn them the hard way might not be measured until later in the process.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then one of the other comments that I heard you make, which I think is really important for us to start thinking about from a measurement point, is the impact of all of the multiple variables present in this sort of thing. So when we think about this long-term change, we introduce long-term variables. So we have elements like chemical changes in the body, we have elements like maturity, we have level of education, literacy. We really...
Home environment is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So home environment is huge because?
Because if we're talking about getting these practices to work, and they only are happening at school, yet they're spending so much more time at home or in their own neighborhood, we want to have a whole system that helps support what we're hoping to do. So the challenge right there is going to be how we're going to find out if in the home these things are actually being done on a regular basis, the new communication methods, so forth. So you can see.
Yeah, the introduction of variables is
and
huge.
the long term is the hopeful that we see over time.
Now, you talked about the involvement of parents. Are these the parents of the offenders? Or are they the parents in the school that are part of the culture?
They're both.
Okay.
Yeah, as part of the process, we actually spend time, a lot of my work is prep work before we do a conference. So I take time with victim, offender, and the people they've affected. And it can be their own parents that are having a say in how they've been affected, because now they have to go down and talk to the vice principal and have all these other deals. So they're part of that restorative practice.
Yeah, okay, all right.
That's going to be hard to measure.
Yeah. So as far as the feedback that you get, as far as the type of data, we talked about quantitative and qualitative data. What kind of data do you think is favored, or is one favored for one thing versus another as you report to these different agencies and school districts?
The districts, I'm sure, are going to try to look at those quantitative hard numbers up front. They really are hoping for what they call wins.
Yeah.
They're wanting to see those numbers go down. They've made the buy-in that they're going to take a year to let this process really take its effect. Nevertheless, they do want to see those hard numbers.
So is that realistic to say change in a year? Change a culture in a year? Measure it?
We're going to find out. This is the first time Anaheim has made this large of a buy-in. We've seen other school districts up Northern California, that have been very successful. And they've got the numbers to back it up.
Okay.
So we're not completely starting from scratch. Nevertheless, we know it's going to have to be tailored to our environment.
So you said they have the numbers. So what are the numbers that they have that we don't have yet?
They've spent time on things like recitativeness, and again, they've had the long term to get their hard numbers. So you only get those specific students for a certain number of years. Whether you're willing and able to track them and get numbers as what they've gone on to higher education, what type of jobs they have, is really difficult. It's a mountainous task.
Now, is there a way, you talked about the difficulty of long-term measurement, so I have this student who's in junior high school or middle school, and then I have them in high school and college. Could you qualitatively interview them over years?
And that's what we plan to do.
And capture things that are important, maybe?
That's what we plan to do. We're hoping to build strong instruments in the qualitative side that helps us understand more quickly, we're talking months to a year, whether they see a difference for themselves. And if they don't, why? Because that's when we're able to tailor and make something work more effectively. But that's going to be on us.
Yeah, now I'm starting to rethink the question that I asked you at the beginning, which is how do you measure effectiveness? Like when do we say it's been effective? And so I guess my question sort of launches us into maybe the difficulty of this area to say, is that a real question appropriate for this environment? In other words, can we ultimately say, okay, this is effective, yes or no? Where I hear you kind of answering me back saying yes and no.
Yeah,
and longer term, we measure qualitative, quantitative, yes and no.
Right.
And then we still have humans involved, which you heard me earlier talking about how humans basically mess up all of our measurement.
They do.
So that's kind of interesting because I'm starting to rethink my question a little bit to say, I don't know if we can say effective, not effective.
We want to say effective, non-effective, but we want to give a longer timeline than we typically would if it's truly experimental. Like if we did some type of research that is hard number.
Right.
We know quickly, repeatable. This is never going to be quite repeatable. We can keep moving it towards the truly repeatable.
Right. And something I find interesting, you made a comment about experiment. This seems to be a pretty hard area to run an experimental design.
Extremely difficult.
And what we're saying there is an experiment that would have high levels of controls. So when we run experiments, we use high levels of control to try to minimize the impact of the human essentially on the process or the presence of other variables. And so one of the questions or comments related to that is to say, could we do experimental design in RJ or restorative justice? And I would say that is going to be extremely difficult.
Well, that actually leads to something that we are doing.
Okay.
As part of our implementation. We're asking the teachers that are willing to try this. We make it voluntary. We ask the teachers to start carrying cards that guide how they're going to interact with the misbehavior.
Okay.
Technically, it's not even misbehavior, it's just some challenging situation. So the language starts becoming repeatable.
Okay.
It avoids things like trying to instantly assign blame, but it asks what happened is your first question. And then what were you thinking when it happened? The same for the victim. We ask them, how are you affected? But by using the same language repeatedly, if we can get everyone using the same, we can start measuring more clearly because we know what they were asked.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that this card is something that a teacher would carry.
Yes.
And then that teacher would have, it looks like there's two sides, so two different sets of questions
Correct.
depending on the situation?
For victim or offender.
Oh, okay. So those are the two sides.
Right.
And then what I hear you also saying is, just on the topic of control, is this notion that we're basically relying on the card to make that language consistent so that we can kind of try to uniform the reactions, essentially, or at least not reactions, what our strategy is for collection.
Right. The impetus for their response was, and we know what question they asked. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, well, thank you for sharing about the restorative practices and restorative justice. Now I want to change topics a little bit.
Okay.
And how I know you is from mediation. So I serve as a mediator, and you do also in court. And so we won't get too specific about the courts, but we serve a number of different courts, and maybe you can tell a little bit about what those services are for Orange County Human Relations, and then also what you do.
Okay. Specifically, we cover about 5 types of courts, everything from small claims to family. And what we do there is we provide free service based on a contract that we have with the county.
Okay.
We have mediators. Most of them have been trained by us, but we know that they're credentialed somewhere. They've got a certification of some sort. And there we go through a mentoring to make sure they're keeping the standard. It's all facilitative, which means it's a voluntary type of mediation.
Okay.
And at the end of the session, we're hoping there's some kind of resolution that they've been able to both agree to.
Okay. All right, so mediation, so if I went to court, just for our viewers who haven't seen this process, if I went to court in small claims, for example, often there would be mediators available who would be able to provide this facilitative alternative.
That's correct.
Okay, and then is this paid for by the county, you said, or is that something, like, is the county the court, or who's footing the bill for the services here?
So due to what's called the DERPA Act, it's the Dispute Resolution Program Act, way back in '86 is when they put this in place. There's a part of the act includes where they can get the funding to carry this out. And it's about $8 out of every person that files for a small claims suit.
Oh, they're the ones paying for it?
Correct. But it's a very small amount.
Yeah.
And what it does is it allows agencies like OC Human Relations to provide the service. It means we have staff, it means we provide trainings, it means we have an ongoing system, documentation, so forth.
Okay, so you know where I'm going next because we've already talked about measurement. Okay, so how do we measure good mediation? like whether it was good or not good. I can say effective, not effective.
Right. And so if we're using the word effective, we say whether it came to a resolution.
Okay.
With the point of a mediation is hopefully that they do come to a resolution of their own agreement.
Okay, so when that happens, what my understanding is that those disputants would end up, the plaintiff and the defendant would end up signing a document that demonstrates or articulates that agreement they came to in mediation, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so they have this document, and so having the document is what I hear you say is the measure of effectiveness, not what's on it?
Yes. Now, there's two sides to that.
Okay.
Part of it is going to be qualitative and over the numbers you're hoping to see.
Okay.
If the satisfaction that they get from it is accurate. In other words, they come up with what we call a stipulation, and
Okay.
it sets the original judgment that would have been levied by the judge
Okay,
on whoever won or
Right.
lost, I should say.
right,
That sets that aside. And the agreement is what's in place.
right.
So no judgment, but guess what? If both parties don't follow through,
Right.
it can be turned to a judgment.
Yeah.
So those hard numbers are how many cases came through, how
Okay.
many went to mediation,
Okay.
how many came to a resolution, and got the stipulation signed.
Okay, so those are all quantitative.
Very quantitative.
So I can say there's this many cases, this percentage went to mediation, this number have stipulations, this many defaulted
Yep.
and ended up with judgments
And
or
the
whatever.
demographics that go along with all those participants. Yeah.
Do you know some demographics that you would share here, or is it just too complicated to kind of sweepingly say?
It depends on year.
Yeah.
We've seen, but typically about between 70 to 80% of those that try mediation end up with the stipulation. It varies, but it feels like a pretty good success.
Yeah, it's a pretty
level.
high number.
Yeah.
So then, would we also know the number of how long the average court case, trial takes? And then could we make that association and say, hey, 80% times these minutes are saving the court X amount of hours per week, per day, per month?
Right. They've actually, under the DERPA Act, they've been able to do that over time. We don't currently do that anymore. What we do is just keep our own records and then send those to the county. They keep track of those stats.
Okay, so
But the interesting stat is how many of those stipulations get returned back for
Yeah.
the judgment, which of course
Yeah.
they're allowed to do.
right, yeah, that's pretty interesting too.
Yeah.
And so we could count that. Okay. So what are some measurements that we could do in mediation that are qualitative then?
It's the satisfaction level.
Okay.
So at the end of the process, we always give both litigants a survey, and it's asking them how they felt they were treated by the mediator, whether they thought the mediation process was useful to them, would they recommend it, do they feel like it addressed the issues that were on the table. And so that's very qualitative. It's like a Likert scale of 1 to 5 or something.
Well, it
like
ends
that.
up being quantitative from Likert, but yeah.
Exactly. We're
Right.
trying to bring that
Right.
back.
You can
We
put
allow-
it on measurements.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. We allow them to give their own reflection.
Yeah,
We give them
and write
space.
some words there too. That's interesting. So whether they're satisfied. So one of the things that occurs to me is I go to small claims. I have a problem with my neighbor or something. I'm in small claims and I'm working this out. Would we ever have people that are that satisfied? I mean, they had an unsatisfying experience to manage. Right? Is it kind of a funny variable to measure in the sense that you're here because you're unsatisfied? Hey, how satisfied are you? Like, can you get someone from one place to the other?
Well, there's that human condition we all bring into it, our own little propensity to create what we believed, our perceptions of things.
Yeah.
And then we're faced with the realities, and we realize that this actually could be quite satisfying because they may have been suing for $6,000 or something. And what we found over the discussions, it was really different for X and X and X reasons. So now they walk away with an agreement they actually feel quite good about, potentially.
So it's possible to get all the way from I have this conflict
Yes.
that is terribly unsatisfying to I have a level of satisfaction.
Absolutely.
It's just an interesting variable to me. I don't know if there's a way to track it in the middle. Probably not, because in mediation we're in that live interaction, so it moves, so to
Exactly.
speak, but it's a pretty interesting variable. What are some things you think we can't measure in court settings?
Stress level.
Okay.
Yeah, the ability to, or the sense that one or the other participants feel like they're truly being heard and all things are being addressed. They have that opportunity while we're mediating, hopefully, but we're not set up to accurately verify, was you heard there?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
impossible. And if we could
Yeah.
understand stress level even,
Yeah.
if we had little electrodes hooked up to them, we could get some kind of quantitative data about how they were experiencing it.
Yeah, or even ask them, but then you interrupt the whole process, right?
Right.
So how stressed are you? I think I've seen every kind of outcome in that category of people more stressed after mediation, less stressed, entirely relieved.
Right.
I mean, it could be anything. Usually less stressed after having that conversation.
Even just to have the thing done.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, and then I want to ask you a couple questions about family, which I know you do. And so that just seems like a difficult measurement area to figure out effectiveness when we're talking about things like child custody or divorce agreements. What are your comments on measuring those kinds of variables in family?
The real difficulty is we don't know where they're coming from. Because if we could get a baseline equivalent of how much difficulty they're having in resolving a custody issue and how long it's been that they've been working at. So we do know when they filed divorce,
Okay.
and we know when they've had certain points of settlement,
Okay.
because those are all part of the court record.
Right.
But
And
we
you
don't,
have that as a mediator. You have the record.
correct.
Okay.
But we're not able to say, was that smooth?
Yeah.
Was mediation better than this before? So again, we're asking them to give us qualitative responses at the end,
Okay.
both on a scale of satisfaction, and they're also able to put specifically their own thoughts.
Well, it kind of resembles what we talked about a minute ago with small claims, but
Yes.
it's on a higher, more emotional level to
really
say,
is.
I had a terribly unsatisfying set of conflicts, and then now I'm going to ask you, how'd you feel about mediating these conflicts?
Right.
And
Right.
we have the
And-
same emotional outcomes.
And sometimes, even though they have a reasonable resolution, they've negotiated their way to that rather than actually collaborated
Oh, right,
and come up with the relationship
Yeah.
that can go on.
right.
And if they're just frustrated and they have to agree today, how can we really measure
So, yeah,
the
that's
satisfaction?
That's pretty interesting because you're commenting on, there's probably levels of quality that exist there in terms of outcomes in family mediation.
Exactly.
And so you have maybe some influence of how the participant maybe would act
Mm-hmm.
or participants, and then that affects, of course, that outcome,
And
which
if
is pretty interesting.
And if they're struggling with how they're going to resolve not custody so much, let's say financial issues, division of assets, and one of them just lost their job. So they're really going to be pushing and driving during that mediation, and it's going to be almost impossible for them to say, was this really effective for you?
Right.
Because they felt like I needed to get what I needed to get.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
a lot of times
Interesting.
conflict is how we perceive it
Yeah.
because of our certain circumstance. And how do you measure a lifetime of perception?
I don't know.
Difficult.
Yeah, very difficult.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the
You're
show to talk about measurement. And I think some things that I've learned is how crucial context is for this conversation.
Absolutely.
Because as we're talking about it, we have context impacting almost every type of measurement you and I have talked about here. To say whether it's the context of the relationship or how the court runs or what the funding sources are, all of that adds up to this complicated area where we have to kind of make decisions and do our best. You heard me say this about
Right.
measuring humans. Do our best to try to figure out what we can know,
Right.
and then ultimately try to benefit others with it.
Right. And our hope is that we're always going to be able to create the best instruments to try to start seeing those patterns and then make our adjustments
Yeah.
as we go forward, especially with the restorative practices.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be here.
Appreciate your input. So we can see from that interview that research is complicated and humans are complicated. And so that reminds us of the difficult enterprise that we are working on. Doesn't mean we can't measure things, but it does mean that we're engaging in a complicated process. And that process is something that we have to try to become better and better at. Now, one of the things that I find that is very present in my conversations with individuals about quantitative methods is that some people don't choose quantitative methods because they simply don't like quantitative. And I want to address that because I think that's a very interesting perspective to say because I don't do it, therefore it's not important. I would suggest that the whole question about how we measure something starts with what we want to know and also what we do know. You know, you saw the video clip that talked about that notion. When we don't make an active decision and just default to what we know, we are narrowing our perspective. So when I hear people say, oh, I don't want to do complex data analysis because I don't like it, that doesn't mean that it's not useful. And so my comment would be, boy, that sort of means that we should be proficient in quantitative and in qualitative. And then that will translate to whatever settings we need, and then we can use whatever tools we need. I would also liken it to the idea of a toolbox, right? You could say, I don't use screwdrivers, I only use hammers, but you're only going to get so far by using a hammer on everything. And so my comment would be, let's commit to this term thinking more broadly about methodology and adding tools to the toolbox so that we can better serve others and make better choices for our organizations. Now, the next guest that I have on the show is actually a student in our current class. And I've invited her because I know her from outside of this experience. I've invited her to come and talk about the course setup to give you a better idea of how it's organized and some of the nuances of the course itself. Let's take a look. So the next guest on my show is Alma Acosta, and she is a brand new graduate student in our NCRP program. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for inviting.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. So what everyone doesn't know who's watching is that a few days ago you signed up for this program.
Yes, I did.
And then I asked you to be on the show immediately.
Yes.
Because we already know each other.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate your willingness to do that. Some of your classmates are getting a look at you. Maybe I'll have some of them come on the show as well.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah. So I thought one of my motivations for having you was to kind of talk to you about what it's like to have that fresh perspective from the outside, and what are you kind of thinking about this class and the program in general. So, but before we get into that, tell us your background. Tell us how you come to us as a new student in this program.
Well, I'm a graduate student here. I just graduated May from Cal State Long Beach, Co Beach. And I graduated with a communication studies degree, which helped me give a lot of insight into this program, because you have to learn how to deal with people's conflicts and how to help them negotiate and communicate with each other, which is something apparently some people do struggle with. You'd be surprised to see how many people struggle with this. And I got firsthand experience with this through this organization called the OCHR Orange County Human Relations internship. And I did an internship at the court where we got to help people come together and create solutions, whether it had to do with small claims cases or civil harassment cases. And it was really interesting to see how people either transformed or through these sessions or continued or persisted with their bad habits.
Yeah, yeah. So you're there to help, and then they choose to accept that help or not, right?
Because unfortunately, you think you have an idea of what's going to happen, but humans always surprise us.
Yeah, actually, something that I'm talking about quite a bit on the show today, right, is this idea that humans create a whole new variable that's maybe a set of variables that changes the dynamics for sure. So you've come to NCRP, you signed up for NCR 507.
Yes.
And what are you thinking at this point about it? What are your thoughts about the school or that class?
Well, it's funny because through this whole summer break, I was like, oh, school, what's that? And as soon as I came back, it hit me, you know what, I'm really excited to be here, to be in a program that I feel is going to be very enriching to me, not just in my career, but in real life. And so when I signed up for this class, I was kind of like thinking, well, quantitative studies, like how am I going to use that? How am I going to sit down through a mediation and have to study everything? But I think it's important to do that. However, as a new student, I I have yet to learn how I'm going to do that.
So sort of the question inherent there is, why do this class?
Yes, exactly. It's like,
Okay.
why is
That's
but-
a fair question,
Yeah.
right? So a couple things. One is that anytime you get into a graduate program, it's really good to be familiar with theory and research because of the type of elevated learning you're engaging in. But the second is, one of my personal goals is to equip all of my students with the ability to do basic or perform basic quantitative analysis, and then also perhaps develop the skills of program evaluation, which is something I'll talk about, and in more detail, of course. But the idea is that it would increase your value leaving here, like if you work for an agency or if you become a consultant or whatever you do, that you'd be able to not only analyze what numbers exist in the data of wherever you're working, but also be able to use those data to institute change. So a way that's kind of interesting to think about that is we collect a lot of data at the court, which I've been there with you before, and we don't tend to analyze it, actually.
We don't.
No. So we do reports, but we don't really analyze like the type of cases, like do we get more of those in February than we do in March? Do we get more neighbor disputes around the holidays? Like there's a lot of interesting questions that we can be analyzing. And so the notion is to kind of marry the academic side with the practical side and say, let's get some like better answers. And so that's kind of the goal behind quantitative, is to say we're a numbers driven world. What do we want to do with those numbers and figure that out? The other thing is we can probably staff better. And you've seen mismatches before in court.
Oh, yes.
Where we say, oh, there's a lot of mediators and no cases, or way too many cases and not enough mediators. And I know you're a bilingual mediator.
Yeah.
And so another way to use the numbers is to anticipate correctly how many bilingual mediators we might need to have. Would be another way to use the numbers.
Yeah.
Right? So just going to teach you guys the basics of quantitative. It sounds like you have a little bit of the basics.
Oh, yeah.
And then teach you, some analysis from there. Now, you said you had some previous training. Do you have training in SPSS?
To be quite honest, when I heard that, I wasn't familiar with it.
Okay.
When I did some work with communication studies, working with numbers, we all had to do it manually. So
Oh, okay.
we unfortunately didn't get the chance to do that, which would have been nice. So I would like to hear more about it.
Okay, so I don't think we've talked about this before, but just for everyone's sake, SPSS is the statistical package for the social sciences. Okay. And it's used broadly by a lot of areas. We would be just one of those in social science. And it's basically a sophisticated program that does higher level quantitative analysis. So you know what Excel is, right?
Yeah.
The spreadsheets. We take Excel spreadsheets and upload them into SPSS to do those analyses. And so what I'm teaching you is how to do that, essentially. And so some of the homeworks that we'll do in class, for example, will be running those programs and doing the reports, and then you'll be able to write what it means. And so I'll give you like a set of data, and then you'll be able to go and upload it into SPSS and work on it.
Thank God. Gosh,
Well, the thing about it is, I don't know if everyone's going to end up needing that skill, but it would be really good for you to know what it is and to know what you're seeing. So if somebody else ran a report, you'd be like, okay, I know what I'm looking at. So that's kind of where we are with that. That's a free program that you can download in our
Good, free is good.
Yeah, in our Dominguez Hills system. So, and I'll send some instructions on that. But but the idea is to have you be basically proficient in SPSS, which doesn't mean you're a star or amazing, but it means that you can actually survive. I always talk about it like swimming and say, I'm teaching you basically to swim, but you're not going to be like the Olympian. Okay, you can go become an Olympian afterwards if you want, but what I'm teaching you to do is swim, and then as you learn how to swim, then you'll be proficient enough to not drown in it.
Good.
Which is sort of the goal. And people have really different reactions to numbers, which is something, of course, I'm talking about today on the show. People kind of like that idea. Some people don't like that idea. Do you have a feeling either way? Like you like numbers, you don't?
I definitely, it's so funny because before I remember, growing up, I was like, numbers aren't that bad. And then as I was finding my major, I found out I didn't like business so much because of numbers or the fear of it. And so I was like, I'll become a communication studies major. Close enough. But, now that I've taken classes figuring out why we need numbers, it's good because I feel like sometimes we need that concrete visual. We need to actually see an amount of to see the impact through numbers.
Right.
And so
So that's funny you say that. I use an example when I teach the live class of quantitative methods, and I use the example of GPA. So let's say your aunt decides to give you $1,000 toward your education, and you're very excited. So your aunt says, "How's it going?" And you say, "It's going great." And your aunt says, "Well, what does great mean?" "I gave you money. Like, how you doing?" "Oh, I'm very above average." Your aunt would be like, "Huh, okay, I'm not sure what that means, right?" But if you say, "I'm getting a 3.5, your aunt goes, "Oh, great, good for you."
Yeah, no worries.
So it's kind of a funny thing how numbers like legitimize the same information. They tell us more like precisely. I'm not saying people don't lie with numbers. Of course they do. We're going to talk about that too, like not using the numbers correctly, and I'll try to train you guys on that. But it's interesting how somehow putting a number on something makes it all seem, it's like real profit or real gains or real time frames, and there's something about that people respond to.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, and that's another reason to do it, honestly, is to study the numbers just to legitimize, because the programs that we're in, one thing that I find when I work with nonprofits is there's a lot of great nonprofits out there, but they don't necessarily always achieve the grant levels they want because they don't have the quantitative analysis to prove their worth, even though they're doing great work. So it's sort of like all the work we do in court, right? We do all these cases, but if you can't see how many we're solving and how many go back to the court, and how many never make it there, or how many get pre-agreements in the hallway, and all these different things, we don't know a lot until we start counting some of that.
Exactly.
And then people kind of understand a little more about what we're doing. Now, it's an online course.
Yes.
Even though I got you live in here, which I'm very happy about. So what are your thoughts about the online portion?
It's funny because most of the only online classes I've ever taken were internships.
Okay.
And so the workload wasn't as, I'm not saying it wasn't heavy, but it wasn't as intimidating. It was very experience worth. And I feel, especially not only is it online, but it's a graduate course. So the material or the courses are going to be very different from undergrad work.
Yeah.
And so it is a bit intimidating. But overall, I feel there is a lot of convenience in that, you have more of an intimate relationship with the professors. You get more contact with them. In addition to that, obviously, there's the convenience of being at home.
Right.
But, as a student, there are, questions as to how am I going to be able to, I guess, make sure that this is right. I'm the type to always want to ask questions, every day.
So you're going to email me 20 times?
I'm going to email you 50 times in a minute. Definitely. But,
fair enough.
But I've heard it's not impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, I would hope it's not impossible.
I don't think it's impossible since
No.
I graduate people every year in that.
Woo!
Yeah, that's good. A couple of thoughts for you on that. One thing to know about me is I do always have an active discussion board called Questions.
Okay.
And so if you get a new assignment and you have questions, a lot of times I find that people have the same question or similar. And so I want people to see my answer. And you might find that you email me less. By looking and going, "Oh yeah, I have that same question. Like, why isn't this working, or what's wrong with that, or whatever?" And so, what I try to do is make those answers visible, just to help you. But it's it's not a perfect system online, of course. But it does have the convenience, and a lot of your peers have, like you, have employment that you're trying to pay the bills and do other responsibilities. So it's not like you can just drop everything and hang out at school, right?
Yeah, but I do appreciate the convenience, and when I think about that, the whole questioning or the asking questions, I feel that there is more of a liberty to ask even more questions or have questions answered, because a lot of the times in classrooms, people feel intimidated to raise their hand.
Right.
And I think it's great that it's going to be available there, because sometimes I've seen this a lot where people will ask, "When is the test date?" And you tell them, and they'll ask the question again within another minute, but the information is always going to be there, and I really like that.
Right. It's in writing.
It's in writing.
It's sort of like
forever.
numbers, right? Where we legitimize it, we make it concrete, like something to observe. You saw probably on there that there's quizzes. Did that surprise you?
I was surprised that there was no test. I'm so used to courses always having quizzes and then a test, or no quizzes and a huge test.
Yeah.
And when I think of quizzes, I think that's awesome, because it's kind of like those apps that remind you, like, did you drink your water today? Did you do this? And it's always,
I need those.
Yeah, exactly. And we need stuff like that to remind us, to refresh our minds, especially as we get older. You just kind of forget things.
Yeah.
And so I think it's good that it's always putting us on our feet, always doing that. And I think that's what we're going to need as we go on throughout our this whole journey of our master's program, we're going to need to have quick reminders like that, especially when we want to do research. We don't want to have to wait on one huge test that we only studied once for and not put it into practice. These quizzes help us put everything into practice.
So you are making it so easy for me. Because a lot of times people have different reaction. They say, why quizzes? We're not in high school or college, undergrad.
Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of your answer and say there's another reason that's kind of really the same as what you said, and that is the material is too difficult to put together and test you on, meaning there's too much to know. And if you're doing homework and then you're doing your project for the course, I find the workload's too high.
Oh yeah.
And so it's like the reminders, like, oh, we can master this concept, take a quiz on it, right? So the quizzes will take some reading, obviously, and understanding, and then people can kind of get the feedback right away and know where they stand, and then go forward from there. But the reason I do it entirely is difficulty, that it's just too much work to be doing the project and do a big test. It's just too much because you have lives, right?
Exactly, and I think sometimes when you have tests, I've seen this a lot where people, they want to form study groups, and there's so much material. You have a whole semester's worth of material, and especially if I procrastinate sometimes, but I do hustle. No, not me.
Not in graduate school.
No, of course not. That used to be a bad habit of mine. But that's what I love about
You gave it up
quizzes.
in May.
Exactly, I gave it up. It graduated with me, like whatever.
Oh, good.
But yes, I think with quizzes that I remember the classes that I did have quizzes for, I felt more involved and I felt that it was a higher priority to me because, of course, like quizzes, you have to think on your feet. You can't expect to wait a whole long time to put it to rest, all your education.
Right. So there's a component that's a program evaluation.
Yes.
Do you have any idea what that is?
Absolutely not.
Okay. So, no, that's okay, because I was thinking about it coming here, and I thought, ooh, I might be explaining that today on the show.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not a bad thing. So you see there's some points attached to that. It's kind of the culminating project.
Yeah.
So what you all will do is you will pick a program of interest, and that's not going to be something I decide. So you'll decide, an agency or a cause or an event or whatever you want to analyze. And I'm pretty open on that because my main goal would be for it to be useful to you and interesting to you.
Okay.
And so what you guys will do is pick a program, and then you're going to do an evaluation of it. And there's specific steps of how you organize that, which I'm going to teach you. Okay. Some people do this for their full-time job. They do program evaluations of programs out there. So they might do that for mediation in the court, or they might do it for a restorative justice program, or they might do it in the school for juvenile delinquency or whatever. We could do it for probation. It's too big of a job, but you can take any program, any scope you want. I'll probably challenge you to make it a smaller scope and to do a formal evaluation of it. And then what you'll do is use those number skills that I've taught you to legitimize that report and then make some recommendations on how they can become better and also congratulate them on what they're doing well. Oh. So you're like a consultant sort of to that thing. I mean, you're not really doing it. I mean, you are doing the program evaluation, but you're not contracted to be that person. And then I'll give you some examples also of program evaluation out there so you can kind of see if I did this for my job, what would I be expected to do. Some people really love that work because they like the originality of going from agency to agency. A lot of agencies need that work done because they have to legitimize why they should be funded. And so they need these evaluations ongoing that prove kind of their worth. So that kind of connects the quantitative to the program evaluation. We also, in program evaluation, will do qualitative as well.
Ooh, okay.
Okay, so it'll integrate quantitative and qualitative, even though this class is mainly quantitative. That's not my fault. That's just how the degree is structured. So, but that gives you some insight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, so the challenge will be to find something that you're interested in.
Yeah.
And then to get access.
Yeah.
Because it's great if they'll give you some data or some, and I've had every kind of organization out there. It doesn't have to be, perfectly aligned with NCRP. If it is, that's great. I had somebody do the Fish and Game Agency in Newport Beach that does the animals that get injured. I can't remember the names. She did, so I'll give you an example. So she did an analysis of that agency doing the rescue. And one of the outcomes of her report was when she ran the analysis of when they were getting animals, they got them all on a Monday because over the weekend people found the penguin or the bird, or not penguin.
I was like, wow, a penguin, a whole penguin.
They found the injured seagull or the they'd find these wildlife, on their hikes or whatever, and they'd turn them in on Monday. And then what they also found is they had none on Tuesdays, but they didn't realize it because so many people did it Monday. And they were fully staffed on Tuesday. So one of her recommendations was to staff half those people on Mondays to help with the workload that most workers were complaining about, and then reduce the workload on the Tuesday, all done through what's called a chi-square analysis. So she did a chi-square analysis of the bird type and the frequency of the type of wildlife coming in and the workers and all that. So what I'll do is try to teach you some of those designs so that they can be used. We'll see what you guys come up with. It's going to be great. Nobody will be an Olympian in program evaluation either, but they will be proficient, I hope.
Yes, I hope.
Yeah, so that would be one of the goals. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the discussion board. Have you worked on those before?
I have.
Okay.
I do like it because it feels like, I hate to do this comparison, but like Facebook, you get to see that there's people that are talking, you get to, but obviously it's more academic.
Yes, it better be.
Yes, oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And I like that because you have that connection with people. You're able to express your ideas and get feedback on it. I think that's very important to get that feedback that we need.
Right. So, okay, so that's been positive. I know people have lots of different feelings about it. It's sort of the only option we have in terms of connecting people, right? We don't have the option to meet up. Some people actually live in foreign countries in our class.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I haven't looked at this class at the exact cities, but usually I have a number of international students.
Interesting.
And so that I love because the perspective is broadened, right? So it's not just the Southern California perspective, it's the international view or views of maybe a non-native English speaker. It's great. So, and then they enrich our discussion very often. So, yeah. What don't you like about discussion boards, or is there anything?
Well, I guess the only thing I don't like is the fact that, you are limited to that screen.
Yeah.
As a communications major, I do love nonverbal communication as well.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I feel like, especially, I'm hoping most people have good grammar on discussion board, but that's also like a little personal pet peeve of mine, but also the way that people express themselves, especially with technology. Sometimes some people don't know how to express themselves correctly, or because it's limited, you don't get to express your ideas as freely. But on the plus side, if you do know how to use it correctly, you do get, some people find it easier to express themselves online. Some people find it easier to express themselves in person throughout their words. So I think that's the only limitation that I would feel, because I feel like sometimes I'm a mix of both. If I take my time writing something elaborate, I feel great. But sometimes there's things that can't be expressed through words. You have to express it out words. But, and I guess the other thing too is, through online, you don't have that, support. You don't feel that support as if like you were in a classroom where you're talking with a colleague. But other than that, I mean, we have an online master's for a reason, so we'll make do with it.
Yeah, the thing that I recommend on the discussion board, and you'll see this in kind of my announcements, but I recommend that you write it on a separate piece of paper and kind of think it through, and then keep a copy of it in case it doesn't get posted, or because it's a terrible pain. We've all done it where you've posted a large thing and then you realize it's been deleted, and you're like, oh my gosh, how will I ever remember what was said in that whole thing? It's like a paper you've written and you think you're going to upload it, and so. So that, I always recommend that. The thing I find interesting about the discussion board is that the nonverbals, some of them do come through in the form of vocabulary choice, in the form of punctuation. No, but you do represent yourself. There's some other additional parts of it that are, how you choose to phrase things. And so that's probably a good reminder for everybody to kind of think about how we come across, right, as a presentation tool. And I think one of my other goals for the discussion board, I always think about this a lot. Maybe the reaction I hope for students is, oh, me too. Like I read this and I understand, oh, they're having problems with this too. Or they got this insight too. Or I saw this and sometimes I'll post TED Talks for you to watch or different things. And you'll say, wow, I was thinking that same thing. And this other student noticed it. I'm not by myself. And I kind of feel like that's an option with an online course to try to kind of bring people together and say, oh, it's not just me out there. Not that that's always the reaction of everybody on the discussion board, right? So,
of course.
And you guys, this semester, I changed the system a little bit where you'll each have a chance to lead the board.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you'll be thinking of the questions and responding to the responses. I'll be in there too,
Interesting.
snooping around, making comments, and answering the other one, which is about questions. But I tried it last semester and it worked really well actually. So it was pretty positive.
I can't wait to do that. That would be awesome.
Yeah, so that'll be good. So I'll designate that for you guys. What other questions can you think of that maybe we should talk about here regarding the course? Anything else on your mind?
Well, I guess some questions I have as a student in this class is, how are we going to use this further down in our master's? I know that this is a research graduate class,
Yes.
and so what are some tips you have in how we can use this?
That's a good question. So I talked about it being useful in your life, like if you're working in agencies or doing analyses out there in the real world. But I guess the other goal that I didn't mention that kind of goes to your question is being able to understand what you're seeing. So basically what happens in a research article is there's 4 sections. There's the review of literature, the method, results, and discussion. You remember that?
Yes.
I know it's been since May that you've been in school. Okay,
yes.
so 4 sections. And this class is about the middle 2. So this is about method and results. And what I find is individuals who aren't trained in quantitative, if they read an article that has quantitative in it, they read the first section and they read the 4th section. So they read, here's what we're going to do, skip, 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 here's what it tells me. And my comment would be, I'm nervous about that because I don't want you to not have the skill and be able to make up your mind whether that author should be concluding that. Years ago, there was this pretty well-known child care study, and it was saying that all child care is good. And there was a counter study done saying all child care is bad, right? And both of them had quantitative analysis inside of them. I remember reading them years ago. And I thought, boy, this is a great example of where I would want to see what I think based on their methods. I would want to be proficient enough to look at the methods and the results and be able to make my conclusion. Because I thought they're looking at kind of the same thing and they have the exact opposite take on it. Now it turns out both researchers were supporting their own life choices. So the person against childcare had resources to be able to stay home, and the person for childcare had their children in childcare.
Oh, wow.
So that, I know. So the thing that struck me though is that more than ever gives us a reason to kind of say, I want to be proficient enough so that someone doesn't make my choices for me, right? I want to be the one to be able to, maybe I don't love reading those sections, but I want to know what I'm seeing. Right? And when I know that, then I can make better choices. So I can think of another example. Let's say you start to read an article about long-term relationships, and you are reading through the review of literature, and you're looking at the long-term relationship data or review of literature, and you're very excited about the study, and then you get to the methods section, and you notice the average age is 25. So you start to wonder about that, but you further see the standard deviation is 5. Now, I haven't taught everyone about standard deviations yet, but if you remember the standard deviation, it helps us know how dispersed the data are. So if I saw that, I would think, oh my gosh, this is an article about long-term relationships, and the highest relationship based on that standard deviation is around 35 years old. These are not long-term relationships. Long-term relationships are like my aunt and uncle who were married 63 years. Like that's a lot longer, right?
Yeah.
And so the point is not so much about do you know that exact number, but you would be able to see things that would influence your opinion, but you would make it for yourself. And so that's kind of our goal in the proficiency in quantitative is to say, gosh, we live in this data world where there's so much data everywhere. Is there a way for us to improve proficiency so that we can make our own choices and then also help others?
Well, that's awesome. That
Yeah.
sounds exciting.
So-
I'm really excited.
Well, good. I'm excited to have you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. It was a
Hopefully we
pleasure.
answered some questions for some people in your course. And I know that I didn't tell you you were going to be on our particular class until today. So sorry.
It's okay.
But anyway, I really appreciate you coming on, and I think it's helpful to hear some of the perspectives. So thank you, and I will see you soon.
Yes, thank you for having me.
The last topic we want to talk about is a very important one, and that is why do we measure something at all? And when we think about that question, why do we measure things? The big answer I think that's out there is that we have to understand sort of the why we do things. Now, some people do research to up their YouTube viewing, some people do research to make money, make a profit, become famous, whatever. My comment would be, I think the best inquiries that you and I can do are ones that help the human condition. Now, there's an example of this. One of my favorite researchers gave a TED Talk about his helping of those identifying Parkinson's disease. And so I'd like you to take a look at this TED Talk by Max Little, who is a math consultant, and see what he is doing to use mathematics to help the human condition.
So, well, I do applied math, and this is a peculiar problem for anyone who does applied math, is that we are like management consultants. No one knows what the hell we do. So I'm going to give you some attempt today to try and explain to you what I do. So dancing is one of the most human of activities. We delight at ballet virtuosos and tap dancers, who you'll see later on. Now, ballet requires an extraordinary level of expertise and a high level of skill, and probably a level of initial suitability that may well have a genetic component to it. Now, sadly, neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease gradually destroy this extraordinary ability, as it is doing to my friend Jan Stripling, who was a virtuoso ballet dancer in his time. So great progress in treatment has been made over the years. However, there are 6.3 million people worldwide who have the disease, and they have to live with incurable weakness, tremor, rigidity, and the other symptoms that go along with the disease. So what we need are objective tools to detect the disease before it's too late. We need to be able to measure progression objectively. And ultimately, the only way we're going to know when we actually have a cure is when we have an objective measure that can answer that for sure. But frustratingly, with Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders, there are no biomarkers. So there's no simple blood test that you can do. And the best that we have is like this 20-minute neurologist test. You have to go to the clinic to do it. It's very, very costly. And that means that outside of clinical trials, it's just never done. It's never done. But what if patients could do this test at home? Now, that would actually save on a difficult trip to the clinic. And what if patients could do that test themselves, right? No expensive staff time required. It takes about $300, by the way, in the neurologist clinic to do it. So what I want to propose to you as an unconventional way in which we can try to achieve this, because you see, in one sense at least, we are all virtuosos like my friend Jan Stripling. So here we have a video of the vibrating vocal folds. Now, this is healthy, and this is somebody making speech sounds, and we can think of ourselves as vocal ballet dancers, because we have to coordinate all of these vocal organs when we make sounds. And we all actually have the genes for it, FOXP2, for example. And like ballet, it takes an extraordinary level of training. I mean, just think how long it takes a child to learn to speak. And from the sound, we can actually track the vocal fold position as it vibrates. And just as the limbs are affected in Parkinson's, so too are the vocal organs. So in the bottom trace, you can see an example of irregular vocal fold tremor. We see all the same symptoms. We see vocal tremor, weakness, and rigidity. And speech actually becomes quieter and more breathy after a while, and that's one of the example symptoms of it. So these vocal effects can actually be quite subtle in some cases, but with any digital microphone and using precision voice analysis software in combination with the latest in machine learning, which is very advanced by now, we can now quantify exactly where somebody lies on the continuum between health and disease using voice signals alone. So these voice-based tests, how do they stack up against expert clinical tests? Well, they're both non-invasive. The neurologist test is non-invasive. They both use existing infrastructure. You don't have to design a whole new set of hospitals to do it. And they're both accurate. Okay, but in addition, voice-based tests are non-expert. That means they can be self-administered. They're high speed, take about 30 seconds at the most. They're ultra-low cost. And we all know what happens. When something becomes ultra-low cost, it becomes massively scalable. And so here are some amazing goals that I think we can deal with now. We can reduce logistical difficulties for patients. No need to go to the clinic for a routine checkup. We can do high-frequency monitoring to get objective data. We can perform low-cost mass recruitment for clinical trials, and we can make population-scale screening feasible for the first time. We have the opportunity to start to search for the early biomarkers of disease before it's too late. So, taking the first steps towards this, today we're launching the Parkinson's Voice Initiative. With Aculab and patients like me, we're aiming to record a very large number of voices worldwide to collect enough data to start to tackle these 4 goals. We have local numbers accessible to 750 million people on the planet. Anyone healthy or with Parkinson's can call in cheaply and leave recordings, a few cents each. And I'm really happy to announce that we've already hit 6% of our target just in 8 hours. Thank you.
So Max, by taking all these samples of,
Yeah.
let's say, 10,000 people,
Yeah.
you'll be able to tell who's healthy and who's not? What are you going to get out of those samples?
So what will happen is that during the call, you have to indicate whether or not you have the disease or not.
Right.
You see, some people may not do it, they may not get through it, but we'll get a very large sample of data that is collected from all different circumstances. And it's getting it in different circumstances that matter, because then we are looking at ironing out the confounding factors and looking for the actual markers of the disease. Yeah.
So you're 86% accurate right now?
It's much better than that. Actually, my student Thanasis, I have to plug in because he's done some fantastic work, and now he has proved that it works over the mobile telephone network as well, which enables this project, and we're getting 99% accuracy.
99. Well, that's an improvement. So,
Yeah.
so what that means is people will be
Yeah.
able to people will be able to call in from their mobile phones and do this test.
Yeah.
And people with Parkinson's could call in, record their voice, and then their doctor can check up on their progress, see where they're doing in this course of the disease.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Max Little, everybody.
Thanks, Tom.
Max Little's research is an example of what individuals can do using math to help other people. Now, sometimes I talk to people about that example and they say, well, that's all great and everything, but I don't really like math. My comment would be, and I think even Max Little would say, it's not really about the math. The math is the vehicle to help us help other people. And so as we think about the math being the vehicle, we can say it's not really about the math. It's really about the outcomes and what it does. Some of you might be musicians, and here's another example that might help. When you play the piano or when you play another instrument, you don't think about the individual notes, although the individual notes are helping you accomplish this greater outcome. It's the same thing with quantitative methodology. So when we think about playing an instrument, it's really not about the notes as much as it is about the music. And so I like to use that analogy just to kind of think about what role the numbers play, and that you don't have to be good at notes, you just have to know how the notes represent, their symbolic representations of what the artist should do to make that music. So the last topic that we want to talk about is this idea of big data. Now, you and I live in a data-driven world. There's no doubt about it. Our data is collected all the time, sometimes even unknowing to you and I. Our phone maybe tracks where we live or where we frequent, locations. We have all kinds of data out there on what we purchase, what we like, what we dislike, all those things. And so the reality is that the era of big data is here to stay and maybe will only get bigger. So as we're thinking about a data-driven world, that is sort of one of the last reasons that we might think, boy, I should become a very good consumer of quantitative methodology because I live in this data-driven world and I need to understand what to do with all of these results. So the next clip is Susan Ettlinger, and she gives a TED Talk, and the area she talks about is what are we going to do with all of the big data? Let's take a look.
Okay, Susan, we get it. You can take data, you can make it mean anything, and this is true. It's absolutely true. But the challenge is that we have this opportunity to try to make meaning out of it ourselves because, frankly, data doesn't create meaning. We do. So, as business people, as consumers, as patients, as citizens, we have a responsibility, I think, to spend more time focusing on our critical thinking skills. Why? Because at this point in our history, as we've heard many times over, we can process exabytes of data at lightning speed. And we have the potential to make bad decisions far more quickly, efficiently, and with far greater impact than we did in the past. Great, right? And so what we need to do instead is spend a little bit more time on things like the humanities and sociology and the social sciences, rhetoric, philosophy, ethics, because they give us context that is so important for big data and because they help us become better critical thinkers. Because after all, if I can spot a problem in an argument, it doesn't much matter whether it's expressed in words or in numbers. And this means teaching ourselves to find those confirmation biases and false correlations and being able to spot a naked emotional appeal from 30 yards. Because something that happens after something doesn't mean it happened because of it necessarily. And if you let me geek out on you for a second, the Romans called this post hoc, ergo propter hoc, after which, therefore because of which.
So we can see from that clip that there are lots of opportunities to see big data out there, but we have to combine that with critical thinking, attention to context, and really great decision making. As you think about your responsibility as a researcher, of course, the overarching question is, do the data really tell us this? That's something we're going to cover in this class. The idea that you and I have to be very discriminating. Some people in our world put numbers together that are not fairly represented. They put numbers together that maybe break some of the assumptions of the models that they come from. We have to become better at understanding what those assumptions are and understanding what it is we're actually seeing. Do the data really tell us this? And maybe even follow it up with another study in order to confirm it. Now today we've talked about a lot of different topics. We've talked about the basics of measurement. We've talked about why we measure things. We've also talked about what we do with all of that research. This is all to lay the foundation, as we've talked with a couple of guests, about this idea of measurement. You and I are faced with data every day, and we have this class where we're starting to analyze quantitative data for our use and for the betterment of others. And as we put all of it together, it creates a foundation for us to go forward. So as you think about this topic this week, think about how numbers play roles in your world and what kind of numbers you're used to seeing and what you think about those numbers. And as you have experienced that through your week, remember that you make all the choices regarding those numbers as you proceed. And if you want to become competent or more competent in the number analysis as a part of your life, then you're able to do that through education. Well, that's the end of our session for today. I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and I hope your day is not just different, but significantly different.